spent a lot of time the past couple of days trying to think about what I was going to say here tonight, and what I realized is that I worked in the magazine world for 30 years. From the lowest level of answering phones and typing up manuscripts starting when I was 22 years old, up to running a magazine for 10 years. And I was thinking it's actually sort of unthinkable from when I was in it, but this entire world just disappeared in the past 10 years. It was a real sort of community and culture of magazine publishing in New York, and I think that we at least thought it was important. I don't know if the rest of the world did, but and it provided good paying jobs to a lot of people who were sort of misfits and probably weren't going to make it anywhere else. And I'm not going to say it's sad that it's gone, or it's been replaced by a whole different media landscape, which is so completely different, and I don't think anyone really understands it anymore. And it's certainly it's very hard to make money publishing on the internet, whereas magazine publishing was an extremely lucrative business. And I mean, I think the people on the editorial side didn't get rich, but the jobs paid well, and it kind of gave you a key to everything. If you worked at one of the top 10 or 15 magazines in the country, you could kind of get any door you wanted opened. Because I think we forget, the internet, it's infinite amount of space. In magazines, there were limits. There were a certain number of pages that could be filled, and you were making a lot of hard choices about what went in and what wouldn't. Everybody wanted to be in those pages. Everybody was trying to get you to come to their parties or come to their this or that. Aside from the magazine, from the daily newspapers and the TV networks, magazines were sort of the alternative source of information. I remember one time, probably about 2012 or 13, someone had left a copy of Rolling Stone from the early 2000s on my desk, and it was thick, and there was so much stuff in it, and just this variety of things, and interviews, it felt like the internet would, this is what, and I just remember thinking, we are doomed. There's just there's no place, this doesn't, it's not, this can't exist anymore. Now a magazine, is barely, it's printed on crappy paper, and it's got no ads in it, and the ads it does have in it are for sex cushions and things like that. You're not getting the big mainstream advertisers, which, I mean, when I started working at Rolling Stone, the ad sales people would go to Detroit once a year and come back with a full schedule for the entire next year of ads, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And, we got to play with that money, and it was a lot of fun. But now it's it's an afterthought if they buy, if anyone buys a page in a magazine. So I think of I had the privilege of just kind of being in this culture which, sort of as it was dying had its final, efflorescence. And I started working at Rolling Stone in 1996. I'd been at I worked at 8 magazines in the 10 years before that. And actually, I came to New York because I wanted to work at Rolling Stone. In fact, I had this distinct, it's like my dream as a kid was to work at Rolling Stone. And hopefully, and so but I had kind of given up on it. And Rolling Stone also, in the period when I was first coming to New York in the first 10 years of my career was, it's like Saturday Night Live, where some years are just terrible and some are great. And Rolling Stone was in a very, sort of editorial backwater in those years. So when I actually got a job there because I was working for a Condé Nast magazine called Details, and I was about to get fired from that job. And I got the call from Rolling Stone on the day that I was told that I had a month to turn my performance around or else they were gonna let me go. So when Rolling Stone called, I was almost Condé Nast was at that point the top, and I was sort of, ashamed and embarrassed that I was losing this job. And then Rolling Stone, which was such an also ran at that point, it felt like, oh, well, I guess that's the end of my career. I'm going to Rolling Stone, which no one reads anymore. But what I didn't realize is that, that's the best time to get there. Because, the owner, Jan Wenner, who is, you can't really talk about Rolling Stone without talking about Jan, because he is he founded the magazine, he was 21. He is probably the smartest person I've ever met in my life, but he will do everything possible to convince you he's not. He's just he's a combination of the smartest guy I ever met and a Tasmanian devil. And, he just walks into a room and just starts ripping things up and insulting people. But I realized very quickly is that everything is a test. And if you're intimidated, it's just you become invisible to him. And he really wasn't very scary underneath it all, because what I figured, and I'd read the magazine since I was 12 years old, and I knew that it's what you were really doing in working at Rolling Stone is feeding the world's most curious mind in Jan Wenner, and this mind that can't be still with itself for a moment. So it needs constant stimulation, whether through gossip or reporting or music criticism. Just everything has to pop, because if Jan gets bored, he gets mad. So this figure, this guy, basically, I wouldn't say he ran my life, but I was just constantly aware that, it's you've got to please the toughest reader in the world, if you want to survive all the time. And no matter what you did yesterday, it's what you're doing now, what you're doing tomorrow is what matters. But also at the same time, I didn't find, some people found it very abusive. I didn't feel abused. I actually felt excited to always have that challenge, because he's basically saying I'm giving you a big checkbook and I have very high expectations, but I'm also giving you this huge opportunity, to play at the highest level, with access to the best writers and the best thinking and the best illustrators, and and everybody wants to be in this magazine, so you're never not going to get a phone call returned. Because so to me it was just it was that feeling of being in the big leagues. You got to keep producing, but at the same time, I loved every second of it, even though there were a lot of days that were not fun. And I think I go back through some of the things I'm most proud of, and within a year when I got there, we were having this talk about what we were going to do for an anniversary issue, and that morphed into, we somehow started talking about McDonald's. And that turned into us hiring this writer named Eric Schlosser, who spent a year, and we probably paid, a lot of money to over this year, and he wrote, these 3 very long pieces that became the basis for the book Fast Food Nation. And we published this thing in 3 30,000 word chunks. 30,000 words is something that will take you about 3 hours to read. So that's what a magazine could do, which is kind of forgotten. And it was partially just because, especially the ad page, the ads. I don't know if this is interesting to people, but in the publishing calendar, it's basically you sell a lot of ads in the spring and in this. You don't sell ads in the winter. Then the magazines get thick in the spring, and they slim down in the summer. Then in the fall, they get really fat. So we always had this challenge that we were going to have these really, we were going to have tons of excess pages in the fall. So there was always this feeling we get to do something big every year. And so those would be the things where we'd be sort of vying for the awards, and we'd often start planning these big stories, the year before, because it would take, you want to give someone 6, 8, 9 months to work on their story, and you could pay them a wage that could be a large part of their income for the year, so like that, I think, is one of the sad things that's disappeared in the internet, where, it's like, if you're working the internet, you get paid $2,500 for a story. Like, that's kind of a win. Like, I don't, so it's very bad for writers, and it's very bad for the craft of journalism, I think, and it pushes everything, I think, into the hot take, gotcha, polarizing, demonize the other side, don't look at the inconsistencies of your side because there's not time for that, and it's like you've got to keep everything as starkly opposed as possible. I think that's sort of the paradigm now, and that something in the culture really changed around 2008, where I think the tribes really, it's probably in the fall of the financial crisis, where everything just became, and I think it was the rise of Twitter also, where everybody had access to flaming each other. And I felt like before then, we could be seen as liberal, but also truth-telling, and liberal, but speaking for something greater. And I'd say kind of from 2008 on, like that went away, that feeling that someone who disagreed with you might read this and disagree in an interesting way, or that you would present readers with something beyond the circumscribed narrative of what that side believed. And it was kind of exciting in a way, just because everything became so high stakes. At that point, like everybody was reacting so intensely to everything. And you were either good or bad, or you were the enemy, or you were the hero one week and the enemy the next, and everything sort of broke down into those camps. But then even like that stopped being fun, and I think it just started getting uglier and uglier. And we did a story which I think that everything really changed is that we did something which I'm still kind of processing, that we had a profile of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who was the kid who set the bomb at the Boston Marathon. And it was actually a really, I thought, great piece of journalism that we did, that we took this kid and just told the life story of this boy who, like, was like kind of a star in his own, like, he'd gone to this very progressive public high school in Boston, and he had escaped a sort of really complicated, horrible family life, and the family that had relocated from Dagestan to Boston, and like this kid kind of looked like he was gonna kind of step out of it and become like an American kid, and then his older brother, who was like just this bad dude, like drew him back in and got him involved in this bombing plot. So we put the kid on the cover, and the reaction was like the most intense thing I've ever been through. And I should have seen it, and I didn't, because nothing that we thought we were doing was about glorifying this kid. But they were like, Rolling Stone is glorifying terrorists. And I don't think we did at all. I think, the story was pitched like, sort of a profile of this unlikely terrorist. And, what does it mean when kids like this are actually becoming the ones who set the bombs and become the terrorists? And, the story was handled, I thought, with, I don't know how to use the word empathy, but understanding. And, I mean, certainly there was, I don't think it glorified him at all, but we got caught in this huge, it was just like, I almost feel like, from my experience, like that was when Trumpism started. Like the reaction to this story, which is I think probably what, like 2012 or 2013, and the vituperation and the rage and the people like demonstrating outside our office and sending me emails saying that that I should be raped at Guantanamo for publishing this story, So then I thought, like, God, we have entered a different world, and then, like, just after that, like, and it's like, it also became, as I said, like, there was something exciting about it because it was like everybody was so emotionally on edge all the time. And, it's, but, I also think it was a real wake-up call, because I think we, from our kind of perspective in New York, thinking that we were sort of out there surveying the culture, and it's like we were not understanding what was actually happening out in the country. And I kind of thought, like, Rolling Stone had sort of been on the side of the people, and suddenly we were being seen as like another one of these East Coast elitist rags, that is selling a narrative, sort of jamming this left-wing narrative down people's throats, which was not my intention, but I could see it and I could feel it, and I found it very disturbing, and obviously that was going to sort of split the country apart over the next few years. But I mean, I think we saw it early on. And then, basically the thing that ended my career in magazines, which was when we published, we got sort of, we made a huge mistake, was that we listened to a fabulist, this woman who was a student at the University of Virginia, saying that she'd been gang raped at a fraternity. And she had sold this story sort of at UVA. She had a huge support network of sort of activists who brought her to us. And so, we published her story, and we published her account, and our reporter did not do the due diligence to figure out that this woman was making it up. But at the same time, she had gone to such incredible lengths to sell this story that, she fooled, a very experienced reporter, very experienced fact checkers, experienced editors, and, looking back on it, we did a sort of after action report. There were a number of places where we should have pulled on a string that we didn't. But at the same time, the tripwires that would have let me know that there was a problem, no one ever came to me and said, we've got a problem here. And so I was, and so that ended up, I don't know if you guys followed the news, but it became the biggest media story of the year, and it was, I was probably going to lose my job anyways, because I was a highly paid, executive of this company at a time when everybody with a high salary was getting nuked, So, like, it's not exactly why I left, but it certainly became the story of why I left. But by that time, I was kind of ready to, I wish I'd moved on in a better way, but, I was kind of done, is what I should say. And, I kind of saw that the magazine had been, was entering a death spiral. The industry was entering a death spiral, and I was ready to move on. But, it also, it was a very sobering experience to sort of get caught up in that, overwhelming and kind of terrifying undertow of the culture war. And it's like I'm trying. It's like I haven't talked about this in a while, but it's like we made a mistake, but I thought that the reaction to it was so intense, and it wasn't that I didn't mind people saying you made a mistake, I could handle that, but it was it was the attributing all these other motives to us that, like we made like I thought we made an honest mistake, and yet, and an understandable mistake when you sort of, and we were fully transparent, saying here's what we did wrong, here's what we regret, and we apologize. But like at that point, it's like the blood was in the water, and the sort of the cultural forces were, that were sort of, that were starting to sort of rip the country apart, came for us. And, it began to really question everything, like how do you determine, the narratives and the truth? And, I could see that, there was all this pressure at the time about, listening to women, believing the stories. So, I know that we didn't look as hard as we would have because we felt we were sort of on board with this new reality. And I was kind of like unconsciously aware of it when we were doing it. But, I thought I was kind of, well, this is a new paradigm, this is a new way of doing things. So, we're going to do it this way. And, we got burned. And then, there was a law. I was gone by the time. There was a jury trial, which found Rolling Stone liable. But actually, we weren't liable for publishing the story. What we were found liable for, in some strange technicality, was that when we published a correction in our editor's notes saying, we now don't believe the story is true, but we left the story on the website, which I actually wanted to pull the story down and just say it's gone, it's retracted, but the boss didn't want to do that. And so the thing that we lost the court case on was that we didn't retract it, that we left the story up. And so they said that in effect we republished the story, that we know once we knew it was wrong. And so that was the basis on which we lost the lawsuit.
Where were your lawyers?
Well, this whole republication thing had never been tried in a court like that. It was, no one had ever made that argument, so I don't think they really saw it coming. Maybe that was their fault because we had who had been the best libel lawyers in New York and that we'd worked with for years. I'd say that when these things go wrong, I don't know if any of you guys ever been on top of something that really went wrong, but it's like there's always a perfect storm kind of mentality to things like there are all these things that happened that were sort of unreproducible events that all led to this decision going wrong. Like not things that happen normally, and like someone, some key person was sick the week that they could, all these like just such in the weeds little things of how the decision got made. But that's not something you never see except in retrospect. But I guess the point was that it was being caught in that undertow, and being caught in the, right in the maw of the culture war that I wasn't prepared for and hadn't really seen. And maybe now I think people are much more aware of that. And I think the other side of it is that there's much more of a self-censoring, sort of hugging the shore or hugging whatever shore you came from mentality, in the journalism business. So I think that journalism is kind of running scared a little bit right now too, in general. Which and I feel bad if in any way I contributed to that, or we contributed to that. But it was not a fun way to end what had been, a really amazing career and a really great opportunity, and an ability to sit in this place and just see so much, and have sort of the world come by, to sort of, because they wanted to be part of it, and they saw, whether politicians or stars or writers, everybody wanted to be, it's like people wanted to be part of it, and So that was really exciting for me. But I think it's easier if you guys just ask me questions, because like I can just ramble on, and but I'd love to hear what people want to know about.
So I read a long piece article about the mistakes you guys had made.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it was in Rolling Stone.
Yeah, we published a long thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very well done, I thought. And so I went to the University of Virginia, undergraduate in law, and so I was paying a decent amount of attention.
Yeah.
My buddies up there were paying closer attention. They started saying how this was a bogus story.
Yeah.
Written. And I chimed in, look, Rolling Stone is so reputable in my mind. They couldn't make a mistake on something like this. And I stood up for you, and then I got shot.
Well, it was funny that I would say, the story was out about 10 days before it got undercut. And in those first 10 days, I had so many people from UVA emailing me, calling me, saying, thank God someone finally exposed the dark side of, I went there in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and I saw all this kind of behavior, and I'm so glad it's finally being brought out in the open. So, I haven't spent time at UVA, I don't know it, but it was interesting how the tide changed. And this woman who made up this, the really amazing story is this woman, this fabulist, and the lengths that she went to manufacture this. She was she had created reams of fake emails, which to support her story and say, well, here's so and so, I wrote an email to her, they wrote me, so it's we didn't think, I guess the emails look very realistic, and these are certainly, because sometimes these systems, they're not really made to protect against sociopaths. It's there is an assumption that most people are mostly telling the truth. And so someone comes along who is so completely upending that, because there are not many people who have that kind of skill of the fabulous that they can get through with. And I think that most of the big scandals like this that you read about, whether it's Rolling Stone or the Washington Post with the writer who made up the story of the teenage crack addict that she won a Pulitzer Prize for, it's these are people who are in their own way kind of extraordinary, in their ability to sort of to to say they're lying is it doesn't give them enough credit. Because it's a level of sort of fabulation, a word. That's what I think it is. And I've always kind of wanted to go find this woman and say, try to understand, what she did and how she must feel about it now. But I've tried to find her, and she's completely disappeared. Maybe changed her name, I don't know. But a couple of years ago, I spent a lot of time trying to track her down, and I couldn't.
Did she not have any responsibility for that? She had no consequences?
No. But I think part of what it was is that, if you're suing someone, you go where the money is. If you'd sued her, you might have won a big judgment, but you're never going to collect on it.
So I'm curious about two things that you said. One was a childhood dream of a teenager becoming manifest and manifesting this in an amazing way with a huge rise. So not very many people either dream it early on and then walk an extremely narrow path. There weren't that many paths that would be very specific.
Well, it's funny. I started reading the magazine for a very specific reason, because I had an older brother who kind of he was 8 years older than me, and I idolized him. And then when he got to his late teens, he became very troubled in a way I didn't understand, and kind of disappeared from my life. And I felt very rejected by it. And he had all these records in his room, and I somehow thought, well, if I learn about these records that he listens to and all these people that he always talks about, maybe he'll pay more attention to me. So I actually started reading Rolling Stone because I wanted to somehow connect to my brother who had sort of disappeared from my life. So it became like very emotionally important to me, when I was that age, because I think it connected to me, to my sort of troubled brother who was sort of basically incapable of having the kind of relationship with me that we had, as an older and younger brother. So it's, I can see how, so then I grew up with this idea that, when I started reading it, it just lit my brain up, because I wanted to read about music, but, for me, the soul of Rolling Stone wasn't about the music that it covered. It was all the other stuff. This idea, which I loved in Rolling Stone, was, and I think this is a big difference between the baby boom generation and now. I was actually listening to this podcast the other day where these 30-year-olds were talking about how 30-year-olds now still feel like they're children. Whereas when they were saying in the 60s, these 21-year-olds were we're in charge. No one's gonna tell us what to do. And no one, so Jan started this magazine when he was 21 years old, but it's not like he started the magazine, it's he decided at age 21 that he was gonna start this magazine that was gonna have as much authority, as the New York Times or Time magazine, which was, an incredibly hubristic thing to think at that age, but, it's that kind of reality distortion field, Steve Jobs thing, where it's you've got that kind of strong personality and a strong will, and you're just going to make people believe it, and that was, I think, one of Jan's great achievements. It's he just decided that if it's in Rolling Stone, it's important. We are not the counterculture. We actually speak for the culture, and because the culture has changed, and what you think is the counterculture is the mainstream, and it's a new mainstream, and we're going to define it and become the voice of it. And that basically lasted for 50 years. There were some ups and downs, but it was an incredible achievement, and I just feel, this great privilege that I got to be part of it and got to define it. For sort of, I think it's sort of last 10 years of relevance.
I just wanted to say, I love Rolling Stone, and I'm one of the baby boomers that believed it was the culture.
Yeah.
And I was in San Francisco, and I don't know, there was an office there. I don't know.
Well, it started in San Francisco,
That's
and it moved to New York in '77. Yeah.
That's what I thought, because I was in the early 70s there, and I worked in rock and roll, so I
Mhm.
met him a few times. And I loved the guy that was on a mission to represent my side.
Yeah.
Because I was one of the ones going to save the planet, because we were, we'll meet in Golden Gate Park, and we were going to stop wars and do all sorts of things, and it was going to be peace and love and kumbaya from then on. But it was the music that was going to lead us, and
Yeah.
so he was representing that. The sad part to me that I hear you saying, and that's very sad to me, isn't just the publishing of magazines being gone, it's the context of the anger and the hate.
Yeah.
Like when Robin Williams killed himself, and his daughter got so many horrible, disgusting texts
Yeah.
about what an idiot he was or something, that she took herself off of the internet.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it's that hate. It's it isn't just the magazines are gone. It's this hate that's manifested on the computer that I don't understand. I understand it's there. I've seen it happen.
Yeah.
And how we can ever stop it, but that's a whole nother story for another day. But I really honor that you spent all that time in something that I found as my culture representing me, because
Yeah.
there was a small niche for that.
Mm-hmm.
We had Time magazine, we had everything on in New York. When Rolling Stone moved back there, it was kind of like, oh no, they divorced San Francisco.
Yeah,
that was rock and roll San Francisco.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
It was on Jan's part. It was a very counterintuitive and brilliant move, and I think that.
Excuse me, could you speak up? We can't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Back here, we just hear a lot of, it's not even a good reverse.
Okay. Is this better if I speak like this?
It's bad, yes.
Okay.
So much.
You bet.
Maybe repeat the question.
Yeah. What was the question?
Oh, I was just asking
Yeah, no, so I was saying when Jan moved the magazine from San Francisco, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that was seen as a betrayal by a lot of people.
Yeah, me.
And I think, you know, I think it's part of what made him what he was and what made him as smart as he was to make that move and to do something which, you know, he kind of chopped off a lot of the authenticity and what made the magazine great and said, you know, we need to play in a different field. And we're going to bring, you know, we're going to come into a different field, but we're still going to be who we were. And, you know, he pulled it off. There were a few pretty rocky years in between, but, you know, until it sort of found its new voice. But, you know, he had to keep changing with the times.
I'm curious about, you know, there were a very small group of people that were in those positions that were discerning and picking out the things that people focused on.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it was yourself or Time Magazine or other groups, was there contact among you? You were very aware of what other people were choosing to cover? Were you in deliberate response to that in some ways?
I mean, I'd say yes and no. I think that one of the things that has changed in media now versus then was that the idea of editing the magazine for yourself and for what you want, what you find interesting, was sort of how I came up, you know. Whereas now it's this idea that, like, you think about the reader first, and do people want to read this? Not, we find this interesting, and we're going to use our skill and our talent and our imagination and, you know, and our access to sort of convince you that what we're interested in, you might be interested in, if that makes sense. And I think that part of the phenomenon is that on the internet, every piece of content has to fight for itself. You know, in the pages of a magazine, like, you know, we would do these surveys of the magazine, and, you know, some of the more ambitious things that we would do, you know, only 30% of the readers would say they were interested in it. And I always thought, yeah, but those are the 30% who subscribe year after, who keep renewing their subscriptions and read it every year. You know, so it doesn't, but now if, like, you put something out there and only 30% of the potential readers are interested in it, that's considered to be a failure, because everything on the internet has got to sort of get onto Twitter by itself and get you to press on that link, and you're not gonna, you know, it's like we always got a lot of flack because we would put, you know, Britney Spears or NSYNC or whoever the new teen idol was on the cover, and like that's some kind of a sellout. And I always thought, no, what we're doing is, like, we're putting Britney Spears on the cover, and there are all these kids all over the country who are buying it for Britney Spears and then are getting Fast Food Nation on the inside and are getting something that's going to really open up their mind and make them might offer them a perspective they've never thought of before. So I thought, of course we're going to put, like, the person who's designed to sell the most copies on the cover, because that's what it's for, because we want, I want as many people as possible reading the magazine. You know, and if you just put, like, cool people on the cover, you know, like Leonard Cohen or something, who like has a very small audience but reads with authenticity, you're going to sell a third, you know, you're going to achieve much less exposure for the magazine. So I was like, bring them on. We're going to put on the teeny bopper idols, because, you know, that's what sells, and we think we've got a pretty good product to sell. You know, it's not, I mean, obviously you can not, because if we sell more covers, I get a bigger bonus. But at the same time, it's like, it wasn't my only intention. You know, I didn't want to just do a magazine that was just for cool people. You know, because that's a very self-selecting and limiting audience. I saw someone's hand go up and back. Yes.
Oh, it's me. Hi, pardon me. My name's Regina Colby. Time Inc. and Newsweek and the whole 9 yards. So I wanted to ask you, you were talking about sort of staying relevant with newer performers. Britney Spears back then was relevant, and the magazine sort of rolling along so that it still has a good audience today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I had a couple of questions for you.
Well, we would do these tests, which like we would mock up covers and take them to malls and ask people what they would want to, which they preferred. And I always thought, you know, that to me, you know, actually I was able to prove it, was that following our gut was no better than listening to the research that we did. You know, and sometimes the research was right, and sometimes it wasn't. You know, and sometimes our gut was right, and sometimes it wasn't. And you know, and the argument became more powerful inside the company when, you know, when the revenues went down and they were looking for reasons to not spend a lot of money on this research.
So you were also talking sort of about the state of journalism today and the internet, and it's hard to hear you, so I might have this wrong. You were talking about sort of short, punchy things that engage and
Yeah.
debate like that. So I was wondering how you would weigh that against something like the New Yorker and other long-form magazines that actually do have explicit content.
Well, yeah, it would, but I would also say that the New Yorker had published many more stories than they do now, and at much greater length. So now the longest story in the New Yorker is the length of a medium story 20 years ago. You know.
Well, if you listen to it, it was still 35 minutes.
Yeah, they're still there. I mean, that's one of the. I mean, they are probably one of the last places that has the luxury to do what they're doing. But I also think the New Yorker has become a much more political sort of writing to a tribe of people. You know, it's like they are hewing to sort of the left-wing line much more than they ever were. And not to say that I'm a right or left-winger, but I think that there's less surprise in the, like, you don't open up the New Yorker anymore, or you rarely open the New Yorker, like, compared to when you used to, and just find something delightful that you never thought you'd be interested in, but you started reading it and you loved it. You know, and that kind of serendipity and that kind of letting writers just go off on strange tangents. Now it's much more. But it's the only, and it's still. I mean, it's. I always think of the metaphor or the thing of Barrett is when 60 Minutes, when it came along in the late 60s, was seen as like a desecration on the tradition of television news because the 60 Minutes was doing things in a shorter and punchier form. You know, and now we see 60 Minutes as like the ultimate in kind of considered long-form journalism. You know, but they were mad because before 60 Minutes, the networks would do these hour-long, almost documentaries, you know, as their sort of prestige news product. And then 60 Minutes came along and was doing 4 stories in that 1 hour. And you go back and you look at the original, at the way 60 Minutes was received when it first premiered, and it was all kind of like, well, this, you know, TV news was fun while it lasted. You know, so, you know, things change, right? Mm-hmm.
What is Wildana doing today? I know that you've been working in interesting projects.
Well, I'm now mostly working in books as a sort of freelance editor, ghostwriter, coach. And I've got a couple. I've been working on a journalism project with Matt Taibbi recently, who was one of sort of Rolling Stone's last big writer, who was someone I brought into the magazine about 20 years ago. So I'm working with him on his Substack right now. So that's been a lot of fun.
I'm curious how you look at, I know that you're so close to it, that there is a lot of mea culpa about the University of Virginia story. But it seems to me that the real storm was not internal, it was that came at a time when there was no forgiveness for a mistake in journalism. This is not the first story that was based on the wrong information.
Yeah.
This is not like no one has ever imagined something not being true.
Right.
It was written about in a
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel good about how, how we acquitted ourselves in the aftermath of it. I don't know if the rest of the world does, but, like, I'm not losing sleep. I mean, I think that we made a mistake that, to me, is very understandable, because I was in the middle of it, and I know exactly what the mistake was, and the exact moment that there's a string we should have pulled on that we didn't. And, I can also see that there are other times in stories where, we made mistakes and we apologized for them, and a day later no one cared about it again. So it was really the time and the subject matter and the moment and the fact. I mean, we were sort of joking. We were like is anybody ever all pissed off right and left as much as we did? I mean, it was coming from all sides. It wasn't like, one side was defending us. It was like everybody had their swords out at us. And, it was a mistake. And I also think, not to make excuses, but, we had also, came at the end of about a 3 to 4 year process of intense cost cutting and staff cutting. And I do think that if that had happened a few years before, we would have had there would have been some safety nets and some people, and someone on staff would have said, this doesn't look right. Because I think that, within editorial staffs are very competitive. And so if editor here has got a big story that everyone is saying is great, and this guy over here isn't part of it, he's going to want to start running that story down. So there would have been someone on staff, but we didn't have the extra editors anymore. We didn't have anyone else who wasn't actually working on the story and sort of invested in it emotionally to say, hey, what about this? No one I at that time was running 2 magazines, because I also ran Men's Journal, which was another magazine that we published. So, I was running 2 magazines. Basically, I waited for people to come to me and say there's a problem here, which, might have been a mistake, but, no one had come to me saying, we've got an issue here. If everyone came to me and said, this story checks out, I feel good about it. So, there's a lot of woulda, shoulda, coulda. But, it's what happened, and, we took our licks.
It just became a bigger story than in another time than it would have been.
Yeah, and I also think that, I didn't understand it at UVA and kind of UVA's institutional pride, and, that they fought back, and they had connections to the Washington Post, and the Washington Post really, every day for weeks was just hammering us, But things like, that's ostensibly why I left the job, but my days were numbered anyways, just because, I'd been there for 10 years, and the company was basically getting rid of everybody who'd been there for a long time and bringing in someone they could pay half as,
So what makes a good editor? What kind of mind does a good editor have to have? Yeah, a perspective kind of mind that looks at and responds to modern.
Yeah, it's just curious. Someone once said to me that, journalism is a license to be curious, which, to me is the best definition I've ever heard of it. You have to be interested in a lot of different things. I like to read serious, long things, and I like to read short, dumb things. And you have to have an equal tolerance for both of those, and to see them in some ways as equally important. You have to understand. It's like you don't have to understand what the reader wants. You have to understand what the reader doesn't know that they want. Because if you're successful, you are providing something that someone didn't know they wanted, or you're giving them. I always thought with magazines, the great thing is you want something in there, the magazine sits in your house for a couple of weeks, and maybe like 10, finally it's been sitting there for 2 weeks, and you're bored one day, and you pick up some story that you didn't think you were interested in, and that's the one that you end up remembering, because it's about some subject you didn't think you cared about, or it's the story's told in such a way, or the writing is so good that that's what the person remembers.
What are your top 3 stories that you've published? Your favorite 3?
My favorite 3 are probably, they're pretty famous ones. We did a big story, probably the story that we did that got the most attention was a profile of Stanley McChrystal, who was the American general running the Afghanistan war. And we sent a reporter to do a profile of him, and the reporter ended up just getting so much more time with the general and his staff that they actually started to tell him the truth. And the article we published ended up getting the general fired by the White House because he had said some kind of spicy things about Joe Biden. And everyone was like, "Oh, Rolling Stone got this general fired." I think that they were looking for a reason to fire this guy, and we came along and gave them a pretext to. But it's funny because what's interesting is the story, which I was really proud of. Like all the headlines were about the general who got fired, but what the story was about was what a fucking failure the Afghan war was, and no one this is what I found depressing. Everybody like the world jumped on this controversy of the fight between the White House and the general, and they didn't actually read the story to say, we're fighting this war that is a complete disaster, and it's stuck in it's stuck in neutral, and we're killing people and not making any progress towards our objectives, and everybody who's fighting the war knows it, but that's what I thought was interesting, and it sort of made me a little sad that was not what the discussion was afterwards. The discussion was, Obama and Crystal, pointing fingers at each other, which was not, what I thought was really notable about the piece. Huh? Well, I was very proud of Fascination, just because that was also kind of the first big thing I did at Rolling Stone. It ended up becoming like a big best-selling book. And it's just it was so fun to be given that much rope, and Jan was just I like this, run with it, and the story is going to be as long as you want it to be. And it felt like it was just this challenge that we got to rise to, and I was very proud of that. The other story I really loved was we had a reporter, the whole controversy during the Iraq War about embedding, that they embedded reporters with the troops, which was seen as a way of the Defense Department controlling the message. But I thought, well, what if we really embed a reporter with the troops to the point where he lives with them and becomes intimate with them and writes the most intense and revealing story of young men at war, which is what we did. So we published another big 3-part story that won all the awards and became the basis for an HBO show. And I would put that with Dispatches, which is a Vietnam book, and other sort of great accounts of war fighting. And I think it's up there, in the literature and the 20th century with that. It's really just an amazing, just way into the psychology and the hardship and the insanity of this war. And it was written in such a way that, one reader would read this thinking this is the most, horrifying anti-war thing I've ever read in my life. And another piece would be go US, another piece would be go USA. So it was fascinating seeing the reaction to that. And, we didn't put our thumb on the scale, and we didn't tell the reader how to think. We just showed it. And, I thought that was kind of a landmark in my career. you know, not in the same way as it was. Like, I don't feel there's anything that, like, I just, every time it appears, I'm excited. And, you know, it's like, I still get the New Yorker, and I would say half the time, I don't read a story in the New Yorker. And it's not because I don't have time, it's just, like, I just think that this strange culture that was allowed to sort of flourish kind of from the 50s until probably about 2015 of American magazines, which, you know, sort of approached, you know, which had a very literary nature and, you know, approached, you know, at its best, I think, you know, was up there with, you know, anything being written in America in commercial magazines. And I think that, you know, that right now, no one's doing that right now in the same way. And I'm not saying there isn't good work at all, because there's still very good work. But I think that, you know, these magazines were nurturing, and they recruited and developed talent, you know, at financial and emotional expense, and, you know, they created kind of clubhouses or cultures or places that people could grow up and be part of, and be part of, you know, an identity. And like that, I think we don't see as much anymore. You know, now it's much more like, I mean, the New Yorker does very good work, but the model is completely different from what it was, is what I would say. And it's a different mindset and a different kind of imagination that is putting it together. And it's still very good, but it's just not the same. And it's not like there are things that you look at, like the New Yorker or Rolling Stone, you know, in their heydays, and the stuff they were published could only be published in that place, because that place had developed sort of values and procedures and ways of doing things, you know, that allowed for these things to grow and these often very strange things, and, like, you know, very strangely talented people who would be given a chance to just go off on tangents. And I don't think we see that as much anymore. I mean, a friend of mine actually said, you know, it's like, you know, magazine staffs, like, they're really more like academic departments. You know, that you were given this little place that was sort of protected from, you know, sort of the regular accounting of, you know, how a business works. You know, because we were in these strange little things where these magazines were so profitable, and you were sort of protected. You know, they created like these little protected places where the editors didn't really have to think about what was going to sell per se. You know, they could think about what they wanted, and sort of, you know, you were challenged to kind of just like, you know, to use your imagination and to use sort of your skills to do something that no one else was doing. And I think that, to me, is what sort of the beauty of that world, and what makes me sad that it sort of has, I was going to say degraded, but it's not, degraded is not the wrong word, because it kind of puts a judgment to it, but it evolved and became something else, is what I would say. That to me doesn't interest me as much. Yeah.
Do you have views about the metaverse with Meta and Facebook creating?
Like, I don't really get it, you know. But I just feel like, and I'm not sure I have to get it, and that feels kind of liberating, you know. Like, whatever it is, I hope I won't be living there. Is, I guess, my feeling. But I probably will be wasting as much time as anyone else is in there. In reality. What?
Do you have similar views about Fox?
I mean, I just, you know, I can't watch Fox or MSNBC. I actually joke that I'm a conscientious objector in the culture wars. I'm just like, I'm bored of people's opinion. I'm bored of my own opinion, you know. And I just think, I can't watch Fox for more than 30 seconds. But I feel the same about MSNBC. It's like, because I think they're like they're in the narrative management business, not in the news business, I think, is what I would say. You know, those cable networks.
Do you read The Economist?
No, but I listen to their podcast almost every day, which I like a lot, The Intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Man, I listen to a lot of podcasts now, I have to say.
What other podcasts do you listen to?
I really like this podcast called Know Your Enemy, which is these two really smart, young, kind of lefty kids, or young men, and they talk about the right and conservatism, but from a really interesting point of view, and very deep dives into, like, I was listening to one yesterday about, it was like almost 2 hours long, talking about Whittaker Chambers, who was this very important figure in the American right in the 50s. And they were talking about Chambers and sort of how he became, like, he was the template for sort of the kinds of people who then became big figures on the right since then. You know, he was a pioneer. So I like that a lot. I mean, that's one I've just discovered. I mean, in a sense, you can tell I'm always listening to a Bob Dylan podcast. Yeah, so, I mean, I didn't really talk about music at all, but music wasn't really my way. I was never a music journalist. I was, I came up more on the news and feature side. And we had a separate music department that, I oversaw it when I was the managing editor, but it was never my job, was to sort of be, covering to the music day by day.
Are you familiar with the long form articles at ESPN.com that Iron Wright Thompson to write?
Oh, he's great. Yeah, I like him a lot.
Yeah, they're so long, and he just has.
Is he still working for them?
He is.
Okay, yeah, because ESPN actually, because they had a magazine which they folded a couple of years ago, but they did some really good, because they actually hired this legendary old Rolling Stone editor, John Walsh, to launch ESPN magazine.
Right, and Wright was a friend of ours, but he spent a lot of time in Ukraine writing about the soccer team. And
Yeah,
the World
no,
Cup.
he's fantastic. I mean, he's kind of like he's kind of like the last great magazine writer, because he came up when he was probably I think he started at 40 now, right? Yeah, so I mean, he kind of started in his late 20s. What?
A little older.
Right, but he kind of he kind of came up at the last time when someone could really make it as a long form writer and be in a place that supported them and nurtured them and gave them the time.
And he was mentored by John Wall.
And he was mentored, yeah. But I'm saying is that, the magazine industry, that's what we did, is we brought people along, and that's, if you were a young, smart, ambitious writer right now, it's way harder to make it, because you're not gonna kind of go somewhere like ESPN where a John Walsh figure is gonna have the time and energy to bring you along. I did a lot of that too. And I think for the people who are starting out now, it's much tougher for them. And they're going to get a different kind of mentoring, and they're probably going to be developing a different kind of writers. And whether that's good or bad, we'll see. But it's just different. And, it's not my world. But he's very good. I like him a lot. Anyone else? I think we've reached our hour limit.
We have reached our hour. You'll be sticking around for a few more minutes, I
Yeah.
suppose, if anyone has any other questions.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, thank you.
Well, thanks for everyone's time. I appreciate it.